Just like you're saying, you can have your cake and eat it too. My thing isn't so much to become an atheist, but my thing is to say, let them eat cake. We have to have some sort of standards, not just for ourselves, but we need some sort of a system that we all live by. If two chimpanzees walk into a coffee shop, if they're from different tribes, they'll impulsively kill each other, but we don't do that.
And thank God for that, Richard.
We do have our standards and we do have our empathy, and we just kind of have to keep working on that. Hopefully it'll develop naturally like everything else did.
Touche. Hi, my name's Glen from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. You are welcome to round 2 with the Faithiest Atheist, Richard Suttles. We had a ding-dong battle about a year ago when we talked about the changing nature of the faith conversations that we're having. And he's joined me again. Richard, thanks so much for coming back.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, you have, since our last conversation, read my book called The Air We Breathe. And I thought it'd be great to ask you about your reflections on a book where I basically kind of popularize arguments that have been made by others, particularly someone like Tom Holland, you might think, who comes and says, look, there is a natural explanation for the surprising rise and triumph of Christianity in the West. And he takes a quite sort of secular approach to here is how Christianity comes into being. And I sort of took his argument and said, yes, the reason why it seems natural is because it has woven itself into our moral presuppositions so much that it is now the air that we breathe. And we believe in these 7 principles, and I go through them in the book: equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And you say you kind of read about those kind of 7 moral presuppositions and you thought this is actually where the faith conversation needs to happen. Tell me about that.
Yes. Yeah, well, just like, I've been doing this for 30 years, as you remember from our last talk. And just like Jonathan Haidt's 5 moral foundations from his book have always been, for me, kind of like my talking points, and I kind of weave off of those. When I read your book after we talked, I was like, well, here's 7 more. And of course they tie into those 5 from Jonathan Haidt. But these are the 7 things that apologists and atheists, for that matter, Islamists, Hindu, Buddhism, Shinto, this is what a lot of people talk about now. And I realize in some cultures, those 7 aren't dominant right now for different reasons. But I think there's a hunger for that. I think if they're not dominant, there's a hunger for that in those cultures. So we can talk to why is there that hunger, and and why did some cultures do it, and why are they doing well if they're doing well. So I thought these are the 7 things we should be talking about, probably more so than Christianity versus atheism, except to say which one of those gets us there, which one of those helps us maintain those.
Right. And that reminds me a little bit of the Ayaan Hirsi Ali kind of conversion, which happened at the end of last year. And there were a lot of sort of new atheist types, and there were a lot of Christians who kind of took the same side on the Ayaan Hirsi Ali conversion. And for both of them, there was this sense of, well, it doesn't matter if Christianity builds a civilization or not. That is very much a secondary reason why anyone would convert to anything. It's got to be, it's got to be true with a capital T. And so, interestingly, the Richard Dawkinses of the world and a bunch of Christians as well, for very understandable reasons, feared that a conversion towards Christianity for anything other than, capital T truth would be, I don't know, hypocritical or manipulative or, treating Christianity as a means to an end and just a political power play sort of thing. And I'm very sensitive to those objections, and I think they are interesting. But I think Ayaan Hirsi Ali was pulling at threads that are interesting to pull at and talking at a civilizational level about the fruits. Jesus said, by their fruits you shall know them. And maybe you can apply that not just to individuals, maybe you can apply that to societies. And maybe if there are fruits on the tree, you can trace them back to the roots. And if you find Jesus in the roots, then maybe that's a way towards faith. How did you process Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story?
Before I get to her, when you're talking about truth-centric and facts, and, I don't care about whether it's helpful, it's just whether or not it's true. The first thing I want to say is that, being in my 50s, I remember in the 70s and the 80s where some of the dominant Christian narratives were so much sort of stories like, things that weren't feasible, like science is of man, and Satan's planting dinosaur bones, and a lot of prosperity preaching. These are the things that New Atheism responded to. The reason why New Atheism died so quickly after it started was that it wasn't really approaching Christianity. It was approaching these narratives in the 70s and 80s that were more about prosperity and believe the Bible because it says so. And then the New Atheists created this culture of facts, 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 truth, truth, truth. And then, of course, from there, the apologists came back and said, no, 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 truth, 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 facts, facts, facts. And then atheists were like, no, 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 truth, 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 facts, facts, facts. And so here we are today, where both sides are like crossing their arms, and they're like, I don't care if I die tomorrow. This is the truth. And like you say, faith positions at a costly price. Both sides are doing that, saying we're the truth. And so I can't blame people who say, okay, there's no way to convince you guys of what's true and what's facts at this point. Can you not kill each other? Can we convince you to not kill each other and go to work and take care of your families? And then, goodness forbid, watch each other's kids if one of you are sick. And so in that respect, I say, yeah, the truth matters. And obviously, if the truth didn't matter, we couldn't have air conditioning and satellites. But at the same time, how we get along is probably the key. So if I meet someone who says, look, I can't demonstrate Christianity to you, but I take care of my family and I try to help my community and I respect you as a person, then I'm going to say, you know what, we can talk about the truth, but I'm just really grateful that you're there. So that's kind of my first answer, is that I think it's really important that we think about how we treat each other, and paying attention to those 7 foundations in your book, more so than the truth. But that's not to say that I'm a relativist or, hey, believe whatever. I do think the truth matters, but I think cohabitation, matters more. I think that's the priority.
And so with that foundation, like how do you process the Ayaan Hirsi Ali story?
So I think she very much is thinking that too. She's thinking like we're beset on all sides, and to use some Christian language, and she's thinking, how do we get out of this? And it's not going to be with me speaking for her. It's not going to be with me screaming at Christians, to stop believing things. I've got to see people like Jordan Peterson, who's saying, okay, how we treat each other and how I think matters. So my mindset and my behavior really, really matters. And in that respect, there's a lot of work that's already been done there on the Judeo-Christian side that I can just agree with. My take is that I agree that we can use a lot of those values. Do we give Christianity credit for those values? That's another thing. But at the same time, I'm happy living with Christians as we're doing those values, and the Christians are like, you're welcome. I'm happy to say, okay, yeah, thanks. Even if it doesn't sink in that it really is true, I'm happy with them thinking that. But at the same time, I'm happy with Mormons and Muslims saying, you're welcome. And, and I'll say, okay, yeah, sure. But so it's less important to me as to where they came from, is that we're doing them and we're valuing.
Yeah. So let's talk about 2 other people in Ayaan's story, because I think they've been significant in the way that faith conversations have happened. She was on stage with Jordan Peterson at the ARC conference when she first kind of came out as a Christian, as it were. And she cited Tom Holland is another name that's important in her conversion story. So first of all, Jordan Peterson, how do you think he's changed the faith conversation over the last 6, 7, 8 years?
Well, one is measurably, because a lot of Christians report that they were an atheists and they were listening to Jordan Peterson through people like, now I can't remember the 2 brothers who were scientists.
The Weinsteins?
One's a professor.
Eric and Brett Weinstein?
Yes, yeah. And so Jordan was just a guy talking to them. And so they kind of got to Jordan Peterson through them, and he was just making a lot of sense. And people were like, hold on, maybe there might be something here. They just enjoyed his lectures, and then they went to church and found out that church wasn't as awful as their atheist peers had led them to believe, and found meaning. And so measurably, he's measurably changed the conversation in that way. And then I think for people who listen to him, because I know a lot of his talks are controversial, and a lot of his views are controversial, and I've seen some of his tweets, and I'm like, sometimes I think he should have an agent who's like, man, this is a powerful thing you just said, but let's take a week before we post this. But I don't judge him by that, because if you judge me by everything I posted and it took off later, then I would, you wouldn't have let me on your show. People wouldn't let me in their homes. So I don't judge him by that. But I think that he's talking about something important. I don't know if we don't. I don't think we talked about this, but his Descartes moment. You know how Descartes has finally realized that no matter what, there's something doing something. So I think, therefore I am. That's his foundation. Jordan Peterson's foundation was that everyone would view the Holocaust as an atrocity. He's like, there's 8 billion people that if you talk about the Holocaust, they would all say that that's awful. Even deniers of it would say, well, the reason why I'm denying it is because it's so awful. So he's like, that's my foundation, is the fact that there's something out there that's so awful that we all, recoil in disgust automatically. And the fact that we recoil in disgust automatically without thinking about it, that he's like, that's not an analysis. That's a automatic recognition of something. So that's his foundation. So I think that's important. I think everyone should say, like, man, what is this stuff? What is this stuff where I'm immediately inspired or immediately disgusted before I even think about it? That's something worth thinking about.
It's something we cannot not know, is one way of putting it. That the Holocaust is wrong. It's something we cannot not know. I watched Zone of Interest just last night, in fact. And do you know the film? It's sort of set adjacent to Auschwitz. It's about the Auschwitz commandant, Rudolf Hoss, and his family. And it's all about the banality of evil. I think you'd really enjoy the film. It's basically Hannah Arendt's kind of the banality of evil as this 90 minutes of just showing a glowing Aryan German family. Who they love their children too, they love their dogs too, and just over the wall you see the plumes of smoke going up from the chimneys, and you just hear the gunshots in the distance and the screams at times, and it's just the sort of the banality of evil. It is so powerful, and there's a scene where Rudolf Hoss, you don't understand why he's gone to the doctor, and the doctor's kind of pressing on his stomach and making sure that that he's in fine health, because a couple of scenes later you just watch him descend a staircase and he sort of dry retches, and then he composes himself and he goes down another flight of stairs and he dry retches, and it's the only hint in the whole 90 minutes that he has any questions about what he's doing. But it is one of those things that you cannot not know. And I think Peterson does a service to us in showing us in 12 Rules for Life that you could have been that guy. If you grew up in the Hitler Youth,
yeah, absolutely,
you could have been that guy. And he's kind of tapping into, what as a Christian I kind of see as sort of original sin or whatever it is. But that sense that we, given the right circumstances, we could find ourselves in his position as well, but that there is something also that makes us dry retch at the whole thing. I think Jordan Peterson wakes us up to that.
Right. And you've inspired like so many thoughts that I need to start writing it down. One thing is, real quick, an admin note, and keep this in the show. But speaking of screams in the distance, I've got 2 teenage daughters and a dog and a wife who's a personal trainer. So you all might hear screams in the distance as well, and that's just normal family life.
Different
here
kinds of screams
of
joy and life.
Right.
Yeah.
And then something you said once in a podcast about how Plato and Aristotle assumed slavery. They didn't condemn it; they assumed it. And I know in your narrative now about this Auschwitz commandant. I know he condones it because he's the commandant, but he assumes it. That stuff over the wall is just, part of the natural stuff, and it's just normal routine background noise against the real important things in his mind. You could take clips of things you and I have said in this last few minutes and make us sound like monsters. But for him, they're routine things in the background that he just assumes while he's thinking, okay, meanwhile, my kids are hungry or I need to go to the doctor, the important things in life that really matter. I think that can be a natural thing that can happen to a lot of people. And maybe in some degrees, we do that now. Maybe there's horrors not too far from us now, and we, just make sure that our house is painted or, something routine like that.
Right. And there was one of the things that the liberators of the camps did was, because it's an ecosystem, Auschwitz does not exist by itself. It needs the village next to it to be complicit in it to some degree. And they would bring the villagers in, and they would show them films of, what it looked like when they liberated the camps. And we still to this day have footage of the locals seeing what happened over the wall, and there's this haunting quote. I forget who it's from, but somebody who said, "We didn't know, but we knew." And it's that whole "we didn't know, but we knew," and there is the righteous mind at play, isn't it? There is the kind of we are very good kind of self-justifiers, and we will tell ourselves a narrative, but reality keeps pressing through nonetheless.
Right, and for those of anybody who missed our first talk, and that's unforgivable, by the way. That's in the Bible. That's unforgivable. Yeah, this whole thing about righteous mind is that there's a part of our mind that says, it's like we talked about, the elephant's going to go to the water no matter what. You're riding on an elephant, and the elephant that you're on is going to go to the water. You can tell yourself whatever you want to tell yourself, but the elephant's going to end up at the water. I think our minds do that. And whether it's natural or whether there's some religious struggle going on, whatever's happening, there's some things that your mind is like, we're going to do this. Now you tell yourself whatever you want to tell yourself, and make up a straw man, make up something else, distract yourself, whatever you want to do. We're going to go do this. So that's like a struggle inside of your mind. But the funny thing is that it happens outside of your conscious awareness, and unless it's something as brutal as like the Holocaust, it might not ever flow itself into your conscious awareness. And I think, as you and I said in the last time, we're all guilty of that. You could be the most religious or the most atheist person in the world, and you're still guilty of that activity happening in your mind.
Did we talk about, or are you aware of the Mitchell and Webb sketch? There are a couple of comedians here in the UK, and they have these sketch shows. And you've probably seen the meme, "Are we the baddies?" I'm sure you've seen that.
Are we the baddies?
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. There are the Nazis, bedded down in the foxhole, and one of them says, why do we have skulls on our uniforms? And they just start piecing things together. They look around the room, and there's a skull picture over there, and there's somebody knitting a skull scarf and things like. And the immortal line is uttered, "Are we the baddies?" And it's hilarious because we never think it.
It's just normal. If that's your culture, then you just see it as normal. And especially if there's something exciting. Like, I always say that the culture that you're born into has a lot of what you believe. But at the same time, if a new culture takes over and it's exciting, and, the Nazis experienced this, they're like, oh, there's a lot of exciting things here. I feel like I have an identity. Then the skulls can make their way in without you paying attention to them.
Surprisingly quickly as well.
Yes.
A very Christian nation ends up, singing hymns to Hitler, the Führer, and saying things of Hitler that were usually reserved for Christ. And within a generation, they're like, oh gosh, like this is...
For all the atheists who say that, well, if they were surprisingly Christian, then they must have hated science. But no, they were the classic type of Christians, the old school Christians, where science was flourishing and diversity was flourishing, and you could have these art shows. And you're right, Berlin was like the place you'd want to be before Nazism took over.
And scientific racism was absolutely 100 years ago. It was absolutely mainstream. That of course the science is pushing you in this direction.
Right.
Which again goes to show that science is science, but the moral framework we press it into becomes incredibly important. And what the moral implications the moral implications that we claim to read out of science, we might well be reading into science, because we've just got these very thick moral lenses that we're looking through.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we said before, we're all moral creatures, and we don't see how deeply that moral stuff gets into us.
I think I mentioned Ashley Null the last time we spoke, which he was summarizing Thomas Cranmer, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote the Book of Common Prayer, which is the sort of the founding document, really, of the third largest denomination of the Church, actually. So the Church of England and the Anglican Communion sort of goes by the Book of Common Prayer, and Cranmer. His anthropology is, in the words of Ashley Null, what the heart loves, the will chooses, and the mind justifies.
You did. That's right. You said that quote in our last talk. Yep.
Yeah, and that's the way we operate. And Jonathan Haidt is sort of kind of saying that as well, with the elephant and the rider and that kind of thing. Can you just explain for us Jonathan Haidt's 5 kind of moral foundations, his moral taste buds?
Yes, and I usually get these wrong, but like we talked about last time, almost 2 of them is like compassion and caring for other people, and almost everybody gets into that. But the other ones have to do with having some sort of an authority and some sort of systems that you are also loyal to. And Jonathan Haidt was saying that sometimes people who think about the authority and the traditions, sometimes there might be more well balanced than someone who's just, oh, I care for you and I'm empathetic about you, and I'm just empathetic and caring about everybody. Jonathan Haidt was like, well, there's also this other set of goals that have to do with the authority and then maintaining that tradition and maintaining those systems. If anybody's familiar with Thomas Sowell, who's had books out for 40 years now about how you have this conflict of visions. You don't just have caring and loving, but you also have this authority and traditions, and they're both important. And then of course the funny thing is that if you get too much into authority, then you can forget about the caring and the humanity, the shared humanity. And if you get too much into the shared humanity and caring, you can forget about having any standards. And I think that's the big message, for you and me and for Thomas Sowell and Jonathan Haidt. The big message is that we're all struggling between empathy for what other people are going through and recognition that we have different experiences that lead to different conclusions. But at the same time, we have to have some sort of standards, not just for ourselves, but, we need some sort of a system that we all live by so that when when we go into a coffee shop and we meet somebody with a different view, we don't do what the chimpanzees do. The chimpanzees, if two chimpanzees walk into a coffee shop, stop me if you heard this before, they'll kill each other. If they're from different tribes and they both go into a coffee shop, they'll be like enemy and they'll impulsively kill each other, but we don't do that. So there's something about us that, hopefully we don't do that. For the most part, Starbucks would report that for the most part, we don't do that. There's something about that.
And thank God for that, Richard. Thank God for that.
Right. Well, so we do have our standards and we do have our empathy, and we just kind of have to keep working on that. And I think your 7, I'm going to keep tying this back to your 7 things.
Yep.
Not just because you're the host, but because I really do think, like, if I could have a hard copy of your book, I'm going to push you to, just make one for me. I'm going to put that back here. Because I think that it matters that we talk about that. Because usually if I'm talking to an atheist or a Christian who's already angry at me, which I get a lot, they're already angry at me, I'll start picking at some of these values, some of these foundations, and get them to say, okay, wait a minute, I like those ideas. Keep talking. Because I think there's some commonality there that we should all keep talking about.
Well, let me see if I can summarize where we've got to and get us to the 7 values. Okay, so interestingly, so where I got to in my book is, I actually mentioned Jonathan Haidt, I think, at one stage, where because he says that basically care and fairness have become really preeminent values, especially on the left. And he says, politically speaking, those on the right tend to have pretty equal affirmations of all 5 moral values. Those on the left tend to very much prioritize care, so that's compassion, and fairness. You could say equality. And I think you can trace that back to the Auschwitz thing, actually. That what we saw with Nazi Germany was the overturning of, in particular, the first 2 of the 7 values. Equality, absolutely, there is a difference between the races, and we will treat them very, very different. And compassion, even before the Holocaust began, there was euthanasia and the putting to death of the disabled, and so there was not the lifting up of the weak and the poor and the marginalized. There was absolutely
right.
The desire for strength.
There were no good Samaritans.
No good Samaritans, and the right thing to do.
There were very few good Samaritans.
Yeah. Of course, you pass on by. That guy would only hold you back, and what we have since World War II is sort of we're not sure what's up. We're very sure what's down. We don't have a pole star to guide us. We have a pit to avoid, and the pit is Auschwitz. And absolutely, Peterson.
I'm going to use that.
It's in the book. It's in the book. But yeah, absolutely. Peterson kind of points us to that. And I think even the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the preamble is all about, in the shadow of the great evil, we have faith in human rights. And they enumerate the human rights in that sort of sense. And as Tom Holland says, for 1900 years of church history, the moral guide was Jesus, and for the last century, the moral guide is Hitler. It's just for the first 1900 years, we did what Jesus would do, and for the last 100 years, we've done the opposite of what Hitler would do. And I think that might be one historical reason why especially care and fairness strikes us as things that you absolutely must kind of value, or else you're a Nazi and you're the worst kind of human being. And we've kind of constructed a morality out of doing the photo negative of Nazism, which itself was in some sense a reaction against 1900 years of Christendom. But to do the photo negative of Nazism is not necessarily to return you to the original vision. And
right. So I think so much of our culture is overreaction to problems that were previously going on. You can keep going.
If you don't have a pole star, then all you're going to do is avoid pits.
Yeah, and so that's going to be, and we'll do this later, but my biggest thing is I don't think there's a pole star. I think there's pit avoidance. And the best cultures just were surrounded by pits. They were beset on all sides, like, I don't know what to do, but we're not doing that, we're not doing that, we're not doing that. And then we're just kind of tiptoeing. And that might be the best times in history was, this is my take. But we'll get to that in a second. One thing, before we lose the anybody who's watching, who's right-wing based, who's watching our show, and they think that we just said something good about the left, about how care and fairness is what they care about, that has changed. The left has now created an authoritarian regime based off of care and fairness. So when John Haidt wrote his book 11 years ago, maybe 12 now, he said the left is all about caring and equality. Great. But now some places in the left, especially on Twitter, have created a new regime that said, we'll tell you today if there's a person from this culture arguing with another person from this culture, we'll investigate which one of those had a harder time. That person will be correct over whatever the issue is, and you will follow what we said, or you're a Nazi. And so, talking about a mirror image of Nazism, they've created an authoritarian regime where this Twitter group decides the correct form of care and fairness. So that's interesting. It's interesting that they took something that was sort of at odds with authoritarianism and made it the authority. So everybody on the right who's watching, come on back. We're not praising the left on that. That was, for me, I think that was a mistake on their part.
Yes.
Care and equality, wonderful. But having one person decide what's equal is probably a problem.
Yes, absolutely. And a phrase that I've developed since writing the book is that I think the seven values that have come through sort of Christian history have been divorced and detached from the wider story, and then they become more free-floating, simply atomized values. So G.K. Chesterton talked about the Christian virtues run amok, and he was writing 100 years ago, and even then he was talking about Christian virtues such as compassion running amok, that are untethered to reality, untethered to any other virtues, untethered to a story that makes sense of it. And some of the cruelest people that you've ever met use the hashtag be kind. And it can absolutely be used as a cudgel. And so it goes from value, or it comes from the fruit of a kind of a civilization and a story to a detached value to now a virtue that you signal. That can mask any number of different nefarious purposes. But yeah, absolutely. Simply to claim care or fairness does not mean that you have the substance.
Right. I think that'd be one of my biggest things to preach. We talked about last time how I talk like I'm in a ministry and I'm preaching. Yeah, one of my biggest things is that you can use the right words. You can use absolutely the correct words. But the thing that you're loyal to and the thing that you're expecting other people to be loyal to, if they don't agree with you, that doesn't mean they don't care or that they're not interested in equality. Just because they just disagree with you doesn't mean that they're monsters. And I think that's something that a lot of people, religious, atheists, right, left, mid-ground, sports fans, they can all forget that. And so that's one of my big things that I preach from the pulpit.
But that's why I think a pole star is important, because otherwise we get triggered by It reminds me of that pit. And what did the Buddha said? That, if you've ever been bitten by a snake, you'll see snakes everywhere, even when it's just a curl of rope, right? And if it's all pit navigation.
If I write a book, I'm going to name you as the co-author, even though you didn't help me write it, just because I've been stealing. It's either going to be, I'm either going to name my book something that you said, or I'm going to call it Stealing from Glen Scrivener. Just like Frank has Stealing from God, mine's going to be Stealing from Glen Scrivener. Right. Because this is very helpful to what I think as well.
So how do we not be reactive? So if we're not going to go with it's the Jesus story, and the Jesus story is true, the Jesus story frames our civilization. It's because God died for you. That's why you believe in compassion. That's why you believe in equality. And there's that larger. So if there's not that larger story, how do we avoid values becoming detached from one another, and we just end up being reactive against one another?
I'm not sure, but this idea about the ideas sort of floating in the air, that makes me think of what I was saying before about how we're surrounded by immaterial ideas. And in our last talk, we talked about how I was thinking like a songbird is born into a community, and the song that the other adults are singing is already there, and it's like waiting for him, even though he has no idea that he's going to take that up. The song, it does know, and it's immaterial. You can't grasp it, but it does exist. So I think a lot of these ideas are floating out there. And I wonder if those ideas didn't start floating out there based off of some awful situation before. And then I wonder if humans didn't like creatively take these ideas floating around the air and say, what if we try some of these other ideas? So we're avoiding the pits, but we're also grasping at these ideas that are floating in the air. Maybe that's the song. And then some cultures did better at that than others. And so, Christianity, now certainly Christianity did really, really well with that. But I would say that a lot of that was trial and error. You and I both have read John Dixon's Bullies and Saints. So I wonder if there wasn't some of the bad stuff that helped sharpen the Christian sense of the good stuff. So that's something that I'm thinking about in terms of natural development of those 7 ideas, is that maybe those ideas came from living long enough in the pits and saying we can't do that. And then we created some concepts or imagined some concepts that were floating in the air. And again, they're immaterial. And again, I don't know if this threatens Christianity, because the story of Christianity could be a struggle rather than having the answer the whole time. The whole thing of Christianity might be a struggle, so that maybe God needed us to come from the pits and then get to a point where we have these ideas. And so maybe the ideas were already there. We just had to discover them. So I'm not really, I don't know this is threatening Christianity so much, but I wonder, just from my natural point of view, if that's not how it happened. If it wasn't trial and error and creativity, and then trying new things, and then that becomes the culture. So we created another culture based off of trial and error, and grabbing these ideas out of the air. That's my thought.
Anyway. I think one thing to talk about that reminds me of is, Christians shouldn't be threatened by the idea of a long story and things developing. I think that's kind of baked into the thing. Even you go to like Matthew 19, Jesus talks about, he's been asked about divorce and remarriage, and he was like, oh well, there was this regime. In the beginning, the Creator made it like this, but actually there's been this fall, and because of hardness of heart, there has been this non-ideal arrangement called the Old Covenant, and that's been going on for quite some time now, and I'm here to restore things to something like what it was in the beginning. But he also says in Matthew chapter 13 that his kingdom will grow like a mustard seed, into the largest plant, or like yeast working its way through dough. And so, like the idea of long development should not be like the way I think the way a Christian should argue should not be exactly the same as the way a Platonist argues. Plato had the realm of ideas in which, the good, the true, and the beautiful are just eternal realities in the mind of God. And I think Platonists can be moral realists in a far more immediate way, in a way that doesn't necessarily have to. That doesn't have to respond to history and development. in the same way that, clearly there's a story to the Bible, and there was something in the beginning, and then there's a fall, and then there's a non-ideal sort of thing, and then Jesus is working on the world in a gradual development sort of sense. And so I don't think Christians are like Platonists, and therefore I think Christians have a category. Even being moral realists, we have a category for development over time, and so we shouldn't be threatened by. In one sense, of course, human civilization's a trial and error. Everybody is. So that's one thing I'd love to say about that. The other thing is, on the naturalistic worldview, you don't have very long to live in a pit before you're an evolutionary dead end. And therefore, like it's so.
Say that again.
So you can't be in a pit for very long before you're an evolutionary dead end, can you? So, like whatever lessons.
Okay, right.
Whatever lessons you learn, have to be learned pretty quickly. And I just wonder whether that becomes quite fear-based and reactive.
I do, but I think that might have been how it worked. I think maybe. Yeah, so I'm sort of assembling my worldview as we talk. But yeah, I think that you have all these horrible things going around, and people are like, I don't have a pole star except to say I hate this, and I hate this, and I hate this, which might have led to them pitching some ideas. And then it took a while before you could have people give it a try. And then maybe for a while, the pit is how you lived. Yeah, I think you and I talked about this 6 or 7 years ago, was that some of the most awful tribes probably ate all the moderate tribes at some point in our history. And so you had to be a monster and a monster tribe in order to stay alive. And so that's why I think now we still inherit that monster capability, because I think maybe our original ancestors, killed everybody, all the Neanderthals and anybody else who was willing to, listen and hear them out rather than fight back. But then you had too many pits and too much fierceness. And maybe from that evolved another sense of people who said, well, I've got to fight this urge to be a monster and try not to kill this other guy. And we talked about this a little bit in the last time with Eleanor Ostrom, who had studied occasions in history where different groups that were warring tribes had figured out how to share a limited natural resource, because just pragmatically they said, if we kill each other, then we all die. And if we destroy this natural resource, then we all die. So let's get past ourselves and come up with a new set of rules and obey those rules. And then because some tribes did that, that's how you get nation states and bigger tribes. So that could have been a natural evolution too, just based off of pragmatic decisions. Like I'm not gonna abandon my tribe, and I'm not gonna betray my values, but at the same time, I'm not gonna go over there to attack you and keep you from the lake, because you'll come over and attack me and keep me from the lake. So then I think something could have evolved from that. That's kind of how I see that could have happened. And then from that comes a pole star where someone says, hey guys, 100 years ago, our always mix up ancestors and descendants. Our ancestors 100 years ago got to this point, and then they started fighting and they screwed up. Let's make sure we don't do that. Let's memorialize these ideas that we grasped from the air, and maybe there's two people doing it. Maybe one person is like, hey, let's just make a pragmatic list. And then his brother goes, what? Oh, hey, God just told me these ideas. And then everyone listens to him. Everyone tells the brother who's saying is pragmatic, go away. And then going to the guy who's like, oh, God just revealed this to me. Maybe that's, something, maybe that's how religion started. I'm grasping at straws here, but, that could be sort of what happened. And if that's the case, then maybe that's a naturalist development of that pole star.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. I think, have you come across Christian Smith? He's a Catholic apologist, but he's written a book called Atheist Overreach, and I think he does a good job. So have you come across him? He's smart guy.
No, I haven't heard of him.
He
I like that title though, because I might be guilty of it.
Atheist Overreach. Well, I mean, what's interesting is that he will absolutely grant that evolution can absolutely teach you amorality, and it can be a pro-social morality. And in fact, it must teach you a pro-social morality. But I think the overreach comes when we talk about something like inviolable human worth and dignity. That absolutely. I mean, the same evolutionary pressures are on chimpanzee societies as well, and yet the idea that there's the inviolable worth of every member of the tribe in a chimpanzee society just doesn't really make sense. And yet you bring that over to...
They wouldn't survive.
And yeah, but his thing is well, of course evolution will teach you to pick nits off your neighbor and to be good to your kith and kin. But it won't teach you some of these things that we prize so very deeply, like human rights, like the fact that, okay, that you mentioned the Good Samaritan. So I go past the guy by the side of the road, like, honestly, it's no harm, no foul if you pass on by, right? And there is, and you could just say it's completely cultural. It's a completely cultural guilt that you feel.
Right. And if anybody who doesn't know the Good Samaritan, how dare you? First of all, how dare you be an atheist and not know the story of the Good Samaritan? Because we're the ones who are saying we're reading the Bible. But the first two who walked by the hurting guy were officials. They were church officials who walked by the dying man and came up with justifications as to why they wouldn't help him.
Exactly.
And I've been curious when Jesus was telling that story, was it a historical story, and that it happened before Jesus? In which case, what was the Samaritan? What was the pole star for that Samaritan? And that led me to the donkey. The fact that he has a donkey and the other two guys don't have a donkey. Maybe the donkey is a symbol there. So maybe the pole star. I'm doing your work now. I might as well just switch sides. But then I wonder if that was the donkey is like a symbol for Jesus, so that maybe Jesus was always there.
I think
everybody knows the pole star.
Jesus is the Good Samaritan in disguise in the story. So he was called a Samaritan by his enemies.
I got the feeling that the good. What's that?
Jesus was called a Samaritan by his enemies.
Right, because he wasn't playing. He wasn't playing along. He wasn't.
Right.
He wasn't towing the line.
Yeah, and it was just an easy epithet to just throw out and discredit him, and like he's filled with compassion, and like the verb compassion, it's the number one way of describing the emotional life of Jesus, and that verb is only used to describe Jesus' emotional life in the Gospels. It's this word for gut-wrenching pity, and it's that kind of stomach-churning love that he has. And I think there's lots of reasons within the text to think that Jesus is kind of in disguise in this story. He's certainly doing a very Jesus-y thing, which is coming from outside the system, and what he does is an intervention, and he does not let nature take its course. And you think, well, in one sense, you think, how dare you? Because maybe the tribe has willed him to be exiled. Or maybe the gods have willed him to be exiled. Or, like, he doesn't look like he'll help the survival of our in-group. So who are you to intervene? And so you see that compassion is really an intervention. And it's very costly. And he expends it, and we've meditated upon that story, and we've meditated upon that storyteller and his compassion for 2,000 years, and we've come to see that there's something in and of itself that is worthwhile, valuable about compassion, such that now we take the opposite view to the people who might have heard the story at the first time. The people hearing the story for the first time might have thought, no harm, no foul, the priest and the Levite who passed on by, whatever. But now there's been a kind of a moral revolution.
I was just going to say, you mentioned this before in another podcast, was that a lot of cultures in the past, if they had heard the story of the Good Samaritan, they would have hated it. You should have stopped after the priest and the Levite and then say, that's the end. And everybody would say, okay, that makes sense. But if you bring in the Good Samaritan who goes against the will of nature and says, no, wait a minute, I'm going to help him, they probably would have been enraged. So we all in the Western, probably more people than not like it now, but I'm just saying there's probably times in history where other cultures would have hated that story.
Yeah.
You can finish. I wanted to make sure I threw that out.
Yeah, no, that's it. And just to bring it back to the Christian Smith atheist overreach thing, I think Christian Smith would say you can get to a certain level of care for the guy beaten up by the side of the road. Like you might You might sort of console him in his demise, and that would be a sort of a kind thing to do. But to build a civilization on that vision of compassion is a surprising thing to do from a purely naturalistic account. You can certainly advocate for pro-social behavior, but the kind of gut-wrenching pity and the kind of sacrificial love it would take to do that, or, as I say, inviolable human worth and dignity, human rights, that sort of thing, that seems to be far beyond what your naturalism can get you to.
Yeah, I remember you've mentioned this. I had not heard of Christian Smith or Atheist Overreach, but that's given me another thing to read. But I had mentioned you before that, like you're saying, in your 7 values, all of us who live these 7 values, this is a faith-based position, and you've even used the metaphor of we're already 6 miles in the air with these 7 values. It's a faith-based position. And you said, living in faith positions at a cost or in a costly way is your words, which I think I want to make the title of my book. So yeah, and I agree with that. And then I just wonder if those ideas, if they didn't develop naturally the way I said, but also with memory, what if I was hurt and my family came and saved me, and then I recovered, and I'm like, you know what, I could have done that for someone else's kid. And then I do it for someone else's kid. And then somebody in another village is like, what? The other person's kid. And they're like, well, hold on. What if it was my kid? And so then our sense of creativity might have kicked in. And again, I'll this isn't based off of observation or, anything like that, and you could say it's my bias and wishful thinking. But then I would say if it is trial and error and creativity, that could possibly be a way. That's my faith-based position, that it could have happened naturally. But I wanted to say something I mentioned I made a post on Facebook the other day, and I said, even if there is this pole star, even if there is this thing that exists for all of us and we're all supposed to be paying attention to it, we still do whatever we want. So I try to say, even if there is this objective standard, the Nazis are still going to be Nazis and ISIS is still going to be ISIS. And then people who say, you know what, for whatever reason, I'm going to go help these other people that aren't, that aren't on my team. I'm still going to do whatever I can for them. Whether they're atheist or religious, we still do, whether that's selfish or whether that's ideology or sense of cooperation, or we're just recognizing something from above, or, I've even heard people who say there's nothing else. It's all meaninglessness. But because of that, I'm going to rise up and do my best. And that's where their sense of purpose comes from. Whichever is the case, I'm just happy that there's people who are more like, I'm going to go help them, and hopefully fewer people who are more like ISIS, who's like, it's got to be my way or I'm going to kill you. I'm on the side of the people that have these 7 values that you mentioned. If it's Christianity or naturalism, I like the 7 values.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a sense in which you can kind of shake your fist at the heavens or protest outside the UN headquarters all you like and say human rights are a real thing. That won't stop the Uyghur Muslims being, being wiped out.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
But I think 2 things to say to that. I think one thing is, it is still a precious thing to be able to say that the Chinese Communist Party are doing something wrong there, and that that's not simply a different way of organizing your society. It's not just different social custom. In China they do great dim sum, and the Communist Party treats the Uyghurs like that. It would be a loss to lose that category of evil, even if you couldn't do anything about it. And then the second thing is just, I think that a society that tells a story in which the highest figure actually stoops down to the lowest gutter, and with gut-wrenching compassion and pity, serves and sacrifice, and that is the greatest demonstration of his glory that there's ever been. And I do think that on aggregate, over centuries, that has a moral formation, on a society. And I guess my question would be, have we ever attempted a moral program with a population in which the way we try to form the population is not so much with a religious superstructure or a story, that kind of narrative, but rather with a more pragmatic sense of how to avoid pits. Like, are we running an experiment that's never been attempted before?
Right. Yeah. In that case, you're right, because I can't think of any society that said, enough of this deity talk. Let's just pragmatically do this. I can't think of any. But Christianity is certainly a case where it worked in a lot of cases. And I can hear all the atheists screaming, well, not always. And you and I we've read Bullies and Saints, so we realize not always. But in both of our cases, we agree that it's part of a journey and trial and error. But you're right. If I'm right, and this can be done naturally, wouldn't it be great if there were naturalist societies I could point to that have 2,000 years of success? And I probably will never get a chance to do that. But then I also want to say, I worry if we're a 300,000-year-old species, I worry for the 298,000 years where people didn't have what we have, and they were like, I've got to do whatever to stay alive. And maybe they were developing some sense of compassion, and they were wiped out. Maybe these values were being formed over the 300,000 years, but I kind of feel sorry for them that they didn't have this pole star introduced into their society. And if they did, we just don't know about it. But I guess for me, it doesn't make sense that a pole star creator would see our species, and say, okay, wait, like in those movies, wait. But then 298,000 years, like, okay, go. I understand J. Warner Wallace's position is that it had to happen right then, but I wonder if that's not like picking and choosing the situations that evolved much longer so that we could be postured for something like that.
Yeah.
No,
that's a good point.
That's why I wonder if that's my sort of a pushback on that.
Yeah. Which, okay, this might sound like a random segue, but it might get us to the figure of Tom Holland, who I mentioned earlier. I think that's one of Tom Holland's big objections as well, to jumping in with both feet with Christianity. I think he talks very movingly about there have been times in his life where he feels absolutely able to believe, not just in human rights, but I think he's pulled at the human rights thread and found the Christian story on the other end, and he's able to kind of take a leap of faith and believe the Christian thing at times, and at other times he's not. And one of the things he says is, when I think about dinosaurs and deep space, which is a way of just talking about the immensity of time and the immensity of space, and I guess the brutality of a human history, in which we've emerged at 11:59 on the cosmic clock, and the rest of the dial has not been a lot of fun. So he struggles with Christianity for exactly those reasons. So there's my segue to Tom Holland. Tell me about, like, you've read Dominion, and are you noticing the kind of impact that he's having in the faith conversations around you?
He gets filed with in the hardcore atheist. So there's different kind of atheists, but even though New Atheism doesn't have the popularity it once did, I would say the most popular atheists are still saying we need to get rid of this religious talk and just start talking factual. So that's still a big part of the conversation. I would say Alex O'Connor is the last remaining non-New atheist who was allowed into New Atheism. And that might be because for 6 or 7 years ago, he was the tip of the spear of that kind of New Atheism talk, especially for the younger generations. Because Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett weren't necessarily having a YouTube channel. Alex O'Connor was that guy. Now he's really shifted over the 7 years, as you and I have seen him shift. But usually the atheist, once an atheist is like buddying up to Christianity, which is my whole ministry, is buddying up to Christianity. Usually once an atheist does that, then the atheists go, okay, trader, nice talking to you. If you go to church or something, have fun. So yeah, Tom Holland, there's not too many atheists who are like, man, Tom Holland's got a point. And if there are, they don't have a famous Facebook page for long. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do, is to say I think Tom Holland has a point. Even if Christianity isn't true, it's still a point there that there's some better ways of doing things. And if Christianity was the one group that happened to make that a dominant talking point for us and part of our even our compulsive thinking, then we should at least give them credit, even if it is just a natural. If Christianity turns out to be nothing more than avoiding pits and grabbing ideas out of the air, we should at least be grateful that it happened, so that we were born in a society where we could at least rebel against Christianity instead of an authoritarian regime where we can't rebel. You were talking about how that worried Tom Holland about the times in history and the vastness of space. C.S. Lewis wrote a whole thing on that. The discarded image is where he worried about how the new scientific discoveries were going to make it impossible for Christians to build a narrative that made sense to them, because in the Christian mind back then, according to him, and C.S. Lewis was not fighting the science. He embraced the science, but he was like, I'm worried how this is going to affect the Christian narrative, because with Christianity, there's like a two-dimensional chart, and we're down here, and the heavens are up here, and it's a fixed space, and we all understand that. But for us to be a tiny dot in this infinite cosmos, I wonder how that's going to make sense. And of course, he wouldn't have known Hugh Ross, but Hugh Ross has made that his bread and butter. He's completely rewritten a type of Christianity that I think C.S. Lewis would sign off on, using the science as we understand it today. So I'm throwing that out there for anybody who's struggling with the stuff that Tom Holland struggled with.
Yes. And I think for both, reading The Discarded Image would be really, really important, because I think there's something about considering the human in all the dignity and worth of the human, that, like, in the image of God, like to frame it biblically. I really think that can be a way to faith, actually, for people, so that there's a place to look, and the place to look is not the far-flung stars and the nebula, but the place to look is into the face of a discarded person, into the face of the guy beaten up by the side of the road, and saying, even if they are,
it's all about the Good Samaritan. Everything's a Good Samaritan.
Isn't it? Yeah. Here's a short story that we've been discussing for 2,000 years. Powerful stuff. But yeah, to look into the face of that discarded person, and to see there is someone whose worth is far beyond whatever they can offer to the tribe, and whatever economic utility I can extract from them. There is somebody who is valuable as such, and has a given kind of. And I am finding it fruitful to talk to people who don't think of themselves as believers, but actually they totally see that the guy beaten up by the side of the road has that, and they can't prove that. I don't think they can prove that logically or scientifically. I don't. I think that's a belief.
I don't either. I don't.
And I think pulling at that thread.
And here, I'm the Faithiest atheist.
Yeah, you are.
I'm saying I'm the Faithiest atheist, so I agree it's a belief too.
And I think I can have my cake and eat it as well, in that, yes, I think it is a faith-based position that is also grounded in something historical, because I think the one at the top of the hierarchy has descended to the deepest depths, and that is the most glorious thing that there's ever been. And therefore we're in touch with something of our creator, even when we're looking at somebody in the gutter. That's my best take. Okay, I'll give you the floor. Your one last chance to convert me, Richard Tuttles. What do you want to throw my way?
Okay, so yeah, two things. One is just a word of warning, just to the world at large. We talked about the China's regime. They are going to keep doing it. We talked about before. Even if there's this pole star, the regime is going to keep saying we're the authority, and anyone who goes against our authority will be dealt with harshly. And your best bet is to feverishly support us, and then we'll see if we can't help you some. But that's your only choice, and they would not mind doing that for the whole world. So keep that in mind if you're thinking China's over there. Try to watch this on TikTok if you think China's over there. This kind of stuff is coming. So I guess I'll sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we've been talking about this all day. Is that there's some authorities that want to continue with their authority despite this pole star, which might be natural or Christian. That's going to happen. So that's kind of a word of warning. And then my second point is that, just like you're saying, you can have your cake and eat it too. My thing isn't so much to become an atheist, but my thing is to say, let them eat cake. If this is what they think is the pole star, give it to them. And then hopefully there'll be more people who have different versions, hopefully of the same pole star. And then our way of living will outcompete. And again, if I'm right, we're competing on this limited planet. Hopefully our way of living will outcompete the authoritarian groups that, not only have this really scary ideal that you have to be loyal to them, but they actually have the technology to back it up right now and to enforce it. Hopefully, those of us who are outside of that can outcompete them with the way that we see the world, so that when other people try to introduce an authoritarian regime to us, we recognize it and we avoid that, so that we can, I think the pole star will disappear underneath authoritarianism. So even if it's an authority that sounds good to you, I think the pole star would disappear. It all ties into loyalty. And man, I'm going to bring this back into the Good Samaritan. It ties into behavior over label, because in the Good Samaritan, here's the Jewish, Messiah talking to a Jewish audience, and the first two characters of the story don't do the right thing. The guy with the wrong label does the right thing. So when he goes, "Here comes a Samaritan," the audience is like, "Boo, boo," but he does the right thing. And so it's behavior over label. If that's the pole star, which I got from the Good Samaritan, then I think maybe there's hope for us. That's my bringing all this together.
That was a brilliant job of bringing it all together. Richard, how can people keep up with you online?
So far, I'm on Facebook and YouTube. My YouTube presence is pathetic, but it's a small start. Hopefully, it'll develop naturally, like everything else did.
Touche. Richard Suttles, thank you very much for joining me.
Man, thank you so much for having me.